what's up? This is D Talking and welcome to Attempting Topics. Today we're going to discuss about phones. How safe are we? Please don't forget to subscribe and share. By doing so, you'll help this channel to grow further. So follow me, I have something for you. Cheers.
There's only one way out from the privacy invading operating systems like iOS, Google Android, and Windows, and that is to use a phone that has an open source operating system. But to the average person, this is all confusing. You hear about some phone alternatives being advertised, and some of them are downright ultra expensive, or some require tech knowledge to self-install, or some think the answer is some flip phone, which unfortunately is disappearing like the dinosaur because no one wants to make that hardware anymore. Fortunately, there are good alternatives, and I will talk about those. I'm happy to promote alternatives that support privacy. Later, I will also tell you about a neat, new, inexpensive solution that you can get soon, and it's so fairly priced. You can afford it to get it, even just to try it out. Before I discuss that though, I'm going to talk in general about open source phones and what difference they make. There's a lot of disinformation out there too, because of course some people use this to sell you something. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because the issue is if the solution works and if it is worth it. What exactly can you do with these open source phones? Are they usable? What can you do and not do with them? Depending on the device, there are changes to behavior that you need to do, and there will be inconveniences. However, I've used these types of phones for many years, and I've learned that it is so unimportant to get hyped up about some new feature on a new flagship phone. Usually it's sold as some new photo capability. Now it's AI to improve your photos, but really it's AI to be the entity watching over your shoulder from here on. Remote control by big tech and the governments they contract to. Phones are the single most responsible device for our complete loss of privacy. I will tell you about alternative phones that are privacy respecting. If you're interested, stay right there. The main advantage of an open source phone is that because you do not provide a Google ID to it, it really trips up the whole Google tracking infrastructure. Same with Apple and the Apple ID. Google IDs from standard Android phones or iPhones mean that every website you visit can record your Google ID and allow Google to know what you're doing anywhere. Regular phones also suffer from continuous telemetry from Apple and Google, with constant tracking of locations, contacts, behaviors, app use, sensors, and now AI that can even read what you're doing on screen. Truly privacy invading, especially when the AI can be remote controlled by big tech. Open source phones have none of these. They cannot report your location and put it in the Google sensor database. They cannot use your device for cross-device tracking. They don't know who's using the phone. In general, all of them are invisible phones to big tech. Now, the carriers can still track you, but big tech does not have access to that information. The main problem with these types of phones is that they may not support all your apps. The best of these, the ones I will describe later as the Google phones, can run 90% of the apps just fine. But there's a small subset of platforms that want to do more privacy invasion, like Google Apps and Uber, for example, which will be prevented from spying on you, so they won't work. Seriously though, there are so few apps that don't work that it has not bothered me. For example, I personally use apps like Spotify, Kindle, Waze, Tesla, bank apps, and so on. Where I can't use the app like Uber, I can use a browser. The real inconvenience is lovely to me, and that is that you cannot use any Google app. None. No YouTube, no Gmail, no Google Docs, no Google Photos, though you can still access those via the browser. The other apps that will not work are paid apps, because there's no way to pay. 90% compatibility is a pretty high number, actually. Some of you think this is a disadvantage, but personally, this kind of action is necessary to sever your life from the surveillance infrastructure. It's not much of a sacrifice. In general, there are two categories of open source phones. I would make a separation between Linux phones and what I call de-Googled phones. This is a confusing distinction because in the end, all these phones really use a Linux kernel, but they are a different family of solutions. Later, I will give you some popular operating systems and products that do the job well for privacy, but stay tuned to the very end where I reveal another surprising new solution. Let me briefly talk about Linux phones for a moment. Unfortunately, I have to say that Linux phones are not really suitable for the North American market currently. The hardware being sold will generally not run with USA carriers. Some of them are experimental products like the Pine phone from Pine64 or the Librem 5 phone from Purism. Neither of these can be daily drivers. Aside from the problems with US carriers, they have unusable battery life. The most successful of these is the Ubuntu Touch project. This is a not-for-profit foundation, and they have a significant following in Europe. But their limitation is the choice of devices, which hopefully will improve soon. One of the hardware options offered for Ubuntu Touch, for example, is the Vola phone, which is again another European model, but this is not suitable in the US. By the way, I have all these Linux phones and OSs. I have a Pine64, a Librem 5, and Ubuntu Touch, so I speak from experience here. If you're a Linux computer user, the idea of a Linux phone is very enticing because you can connect to the phone like any Linux and control things in it. This is very satisfying for the geeks. But generally, the only way to run common popular apps would be to use web apps. These are more like using a Linux desktop, except it's smaller. Hopefully this will all change as more people adopt them, but that's the current state of this at the moment. And this is why I hardly talk about Linux phones anymore. Not because I don't support them, it's just because there's nothing offered that can work well in the US currently. The next category of phones, which are really the mainstream options in the market today, are what I've been calling de-Googled phones. To be specific, these phones are based off the Android open source project. This is really open source. In fact, if you're a programmer, you can go to the site source.android.com and you can read the source code. Now, this is a long story because, of course, Android open source project, AOSP, is actually run by Google. They're not the only members, but they coordinate all the changes. So you would think, why would I recommend something made by Google? Well, that's the thing. It is open source, as I said, and that means anyone can copy it and start a project, which is called a fork. And because it is made to be shared, there is not a single bit of proprietary Google code on it. There's some occasional connection to Google in some parts, but being a project you can copy, you can change all that. What Google did here is to get the benefits of community development for new device drivers and new form factors with the open source, while their own team is dedicated to the user interface. But again, there is no Google spyware on AOSP. Lucky for us. This access to open source created a whole industry of options that are generally called custom ROMs for phones, all based off AOSP. Just so you understand how Google works with OEMs like Samsung, LG, or OnePlus, for example, Google has agreements with these manufacturers. First, the OEMs contribute to the project by creating drivers for their devices. They test this using AOSP. So AOSP benefits from getting the latest drivers. Then when they're ready to ship a new model, they then overlay another layer of Android programs from Google, which is referred to as Google Mobile Services, GMS. Often this code will replace some code in the open source to proprietary versions. This will now include all the spyware code for telemetry, Google Play Store, location tracking, notifications, and other things that connect the device to Google. GMS is licensed by the manufacturer and allows them to say they are Android phones. But those who develop and modify AOSP-based custom ROMs for phones can replace whatever the OEM installed on a phone and restore AOSP to it, though some OEMs prevent this, notably Samsung. If you're successful installing AOSP on a phone, then this is without Google GMS code, so it now becomes de-Googled. There are several companies that make de-Google custom ROMs or AOSP-based operating systems. The general advantage of using any of these, assuming they do not add the Google GMS code, is that none of them have a Google ID. So there's nothing that actually identifies the phone to Google. This is a huge advantage as it stops tracking in its tracks. None of these AOSP options have AI, so you don't have to worry about that. None of these options have any continuous connections with Google, though some occasional connection may occur for some of them. So in general, the reason I don't state for you which one is the best is because they all do the basic job for privacy, but some are better than others.
This is the topic.